Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you had a really positive experience shooting that exposure assignment. And for those of you who are trying to sneak by without shooting it, nah, don't do it. Turn off the video, go shoot the assignment, and then come back and join us. More than anything, what I want to see you grow and I want to see you become better as a photographer as you go through this course. And the only way that that's going to happen is if you apply the concepts that you're learning in each of these videos. So go shoot it, come back and join us. For those of you who did go shoot the assignment, hopefully it was a really positive experience, but I know that some of you may have struggled. If you did struggle, I want to encourage you beneath the video to post any questions, concerns, comments that you had. And then I also want to encourage those of you who, maybe blasted through the assignment with no problem, or for those of you who struggled but figured it out, check out those comments. If any of your fellow photographers are struggling out there and you've got the skill set now to help them, do it. Respond to their questions, help them out, and let's all grow together as a community. All right, so in this video, we are going to be talking about one of the three exposure controls. We've already introduced those in the previous video, but from this point on, we're going to dive a little bit deeper, and we're going to explore some of the more aesthetic elements of these mechanical features of our camera. So let's talk about ISO. Before we dive into the creative aspects, I want to do a quick refresher on the ISO, I guess, as it relates to exposure. So let's take a look at the first slide and break this down. If you remember from the previous assignment, we talked about how the bigger the number on the ISO, the more sensitive your camera becomes to light. So at 3200 or 1600 ISO, you're going to require very little light to expose the photograph. It's sort of like if you think about, someone who's a very sensitive person. If they're very, very sensitive, it requires very little to set them off. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the lower the number, the less sensitive to light your camera becomes. So at an ISO 100 or 50, or if you happen to have 25 in your camera, that's going to require an enormous amount of light to expose the sensor, to expose your photograph. And again, you can think of it as a person. Someone who is totally insensitive, it requires a huge amount of effort to set them off. So that's ISO as it relates to exposure. And we're going to explore this a little bit more in sort of a little mini assignment that I've got for you at the end of this lesson. ISO as it relates to exposure. But before we get there, let's talk now about the aesthetic aspects of ISO. So in the shot on the left, you'll notice that when I blow it up at 3200 ISO, that bird becomes very gritty and grainy. With the ISO 100 shot, however, it's really sharp and clear. Another thing that you'll notice in ISO 3200 is that the colors lose something. They become more desaturated, less vibrant. Whereas at ISO 100, we get a lot more vibrancy in the color. And then the last thing that you'll notice is that with ISO 3200, the image becomes very sharp, not very sharp, very soft. It loses detail. Compare the beak, compare the eye, and compare the detail in the feathers. You kind of lose that between 3200 ISO and 100 ISO. So you may wonder, why in the world then would I ever want to shoot at 3200 ISO? Why would I want to do that? Well, at this point in the course moving forward, you're going to have to ask yourself that question quite a bit because, the answer isn't always as obvious as you think. As you move forward in this class, what I want to encourage you to do is pre-visualize. As you're shooting, look through the camera and ask yourself, what am I trying to capture? What emotion am I trying to evoke through the photograph that I'm taking? If I'm going out and I want to create sort of maybe a dark, grungy feel, ISO 3200 may be the better option. On the other hand, if I'm shooting like a landscape or something and I want the colors to be vibrant and powerful, I want to blow the thing up and have it be super sharp, well, ISO 100 is probably going to suit me a lot better. So you now have a creative tool under your belt that as you're out there shooting, you can start asking yourself, what do I really want here? What do I want to create? And is ISO 3200 going to be better, or ISO 800, or ISO 100? What's going to work the best? You now know that ISO controls the vibrancy of the color, the sharpness or softness of the image, and the graininess or the clarity of the image. So you got that under your belt. All right, at this point, I want to review the mini assignment that goes along with this lesson, and then we're going to walk over into the camera sim and I'm going to show you how you go about doing that. So let's jump back over to the course now. And you'll notice that in the lesson on the left or the right hand side are action steps. What I want you to do here is just go out and play with the range of ISO settings that are in your camera. And I would recommend too doing that in full stop increments. If you do it in third stop increments, you're not going to see a huge change. One stop, you'll definitely be able to see a change as you move from the low end to the high end or the high end to the low end. But I want you to go out and just shoot. And then later, when you download the pictures, take a look and see what impact that had on your photograph. The next thing I want you to do, it says that on a bright sunny day, select an aperture of f11, a shutter speed of 60, and an ISO of 400. Then adjust only the ISO to dial in the perfect exposure. Let's take a look at the last check mark here because it's pretty much the same thing. Indoors, select an aperture of 5.6, a shutter speed of 60, and an ISO of 400. Then adjust the ISO to dial in the perfect exposure. So basically, you're going to do this outside and you're going to do it inside. And when you do that, I want you to play around with different lights. So for example, when you're outside, maybe a sunny midday light, end of day light, after the sun has set. Indoors, maybe you've got some bright lights, maybe you've got some dim lights. I want you to play around with different types of light. Let's walk over to the camera sim so I can show you exactly what it is I'm talking about here. All right, so here in the camera sim, you can see I've got it set to what I'd outlined. I've got the aperture set at f11, the shutter at 1/60th, and the ISO at 400. Now you'll notice when I dial that in, with the circumstances, the lighting situation I've got here, it's overexposed by one stop. Now in the past, I had you adjust the aperture, the shutter speed. This time, you're leaving the aperture and the shutter speed fixed, and I'm going to adjust only the ISO. You'll notice that as I go from 400 to 200, that lines the bar right up in the middle, and I've got a great exposure. Go ahead and take the shot, and there we go, looking good. I'll go ahead and do this exact same thing in an indoor setting, just playing with the settings that I've recommended. And one thing that I do want to say, you may run into a scenario where, like for example, I'm shooting outside, maybe the sun starts to set or it's after the sun is set, and I'm still stuck at f11 1/60th, and I've dialed my ISO maybe all the way to 3200 and it's still saying I'm underexposed. If that's the case, just walk away and say, well, that's not going to work. All right, and that is ISO. So I want you to go shoot this little mini assignment, play around with ISO, see the impact that ISO has on exposure and how you can use ISO to control exposure. And then as you then process those pictures, pull them over onto your computer, take a look at those aesthetic attributes of ISO and see what your camera is capable of.